Great. Are people seeing the right thing?
Looks
Yep.
good.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, and I'm very grateful and for the honor and the opportunity to speak with you about a topic that clearly dear to all our hearts. Going to focus today more on data sharing in the clinical trial space, and my goal in the next 20 minutes is to just give a review and framing for what I'm sure will be a vigorous discussion later on. And I guess the question really is getting from here to there. Where is here and where is there, and what's in between? And so let me just move on to the next slide here, which would be including my disclosures. First and foremost, that I am co-founder of Vivli. I'm also on the board of directors and consultant to Vivli, a nonprofit organization that shares participant level data in clinical trials, so directly in this space. And I'll be mentioning some Vivli work along the way here. I'm also a General Assembly member, really like a trustee of the Commons Project Foundation that does data sharing, broadly speaking, in EHR and digital health, and a co-founder of OpenM Health, also a nonprofit for open digital data sharing. A bit of history, some of this would be old hat to many of you. There has been an evolution of transparency in clinical trials and clinical trial data, starting in the early 2000s there, a leading policy by the ICMJE, International Committee for Medical Journal Editors, really the leading medical journals, New England Journal, JAMA, Lancet, and so forth, requiring that trials be registered before they get published. The WHO had a global policy. I led that work out of Geneva in 2006. And of course, the FDA also started to require registration of trials. So we know that a trial exists. If you don't know it exists, it's hard to do anything about it. And then subsequently, more and more of an appreciation that, knowing the study exists means you need to know what the results are in a non-biased and complete fashion. And so firstly, sharing summary data, and now more and more a movement towards sharing IPD, individual participant level data, and a series of statements and policies and so forth, as you see here. So it's really been a trajectory and momentum. In 2020, I and some thought leaders, including Dr. Drazen, published an article in Science calling for NIH to modify what at that time was a draft data sharing policy. And that draft policy was very supportive of data sharing, but it didn't mandate it. And we really felt that, it's not going to happen unless you mandate it. This article was published March 20th of 2020, and certain world events became quite dominant starting that very week. Nevertheless, the NIH did move ahead with this new data sharing policy. Many of you know this comes into effect in January 2023, which is really just right around the corner. And it does set a new floor for data sharing. It's important to note that this policy strongly encourages, but to be very clear, it does not require, it does not mandate sharing. I guess it was just a step too far for NIH, but certainly a strong move towards sharing. So a bit of the details here. All proposals must include a 2-page data sharing plan. That's the requirement, a plan. And it needs to detail the who, what, when, where, and how. Okay, and this applies to all NIH-funded research, not just clinical trials, right? And NIH strongly encourages the use of established repositories, and I'll have more to say about that at the end of this talk. The data should be made accessible as soon as possible. You see that it sort of sets some expectations, but doesn't really draw lines very much. But it does say that your budget can include data sharing costs. The data sharing plans are not reviewed as part of the science, and that's somewhat disappointing. Peer reviewers can comment on the plans in the budget, but it doesn't get incorporated into overall scientific score. So that's the policy that's coming into fore in less than a year. For clinical trials, data sharing in particular, I think we want to think carefully and explicitly about balancing risks and benefits. We all want science to be open and maximizes the value of the data collected. It also respects participants' contributions in clinical trials, that they're really giving of themselves, of their blood, literally, right? On the other hand, there's concern about privacy. of participants. And of course, if you're sharing data about mice, I think you can be way over on the left in openness. If you were sharing human subjects data, human participants data, your calculus is really more, to the right, and thinking about mechanisms that protect privacy. I don't think that undermines the goal of openness and transparency. Sometimes I hear people say things like, oh, you do manage access, therefore you're not behind open science. I think that's really a false dichotomy. I think it's a balance of risks and benefits. And that's something I think we need to work through as a community when we promote sharing of clinical trial data. So where are we today in clinical trials data sharing? Our team at Vivli thought, there's a pandemic. What better time to share your data than during a deadly global pandemic? If you're not going to share now, when are you going to share? So we thought that data sharing intent during a pandemic would give us some insight into the sort of the upper bound for the intent of a broad community for sharing their data, sharing their clinical trial data. So we published this work in Contemporary Clinical Trials earlier this year. So we looked at interventional trials on COVID in humans that were registered in clinicaltrials.gov before September of last year, and we identified 2,700 trials there. And we looked in this field in clinical trials called Plan to Share IPD, okay? So it's kind of like a yes-no kind of field. So why don't people type into the chat, and I believe I can see it. What percent do you think people who registered, these are interventional trials in humans for COVID, what percent do you think said that they would share their data at the conclusion of their study? 15%. Okay, what else? 25. Okay, we have 10, 12, 25. Okay, so ranging, 5. Okay. All right, so we have a range of 5 to 25. And I know these are, you guys are experts in this field, many of you. Oh, someone's super optimistic, 70%. Okay, any others? I'm going to ask you later for publication, so keep that in mind, okay? These are registered studies, and what did we find? 15%. 15%. So somebody nailed it. Michael Frank nailed it. And that's up from like a 5.5 to 10.8. There were some publications in 2020. I think that was, so I think there is a higher intent, whether that's just over time that intent to share has gone up, or it's a COVID specific thing, right? But still 15% I think is, to me, is still dismayingly low. It turns out there was a lot of confusion actually about what it means to share data. This Plan to Share IPD field is actually not that straightforward. And we looked a little bit deeper into just what exactly people meant by, yes, I'll share my data. And there was a lot of churn. It was a very noisy response. 31 trials, we moved from the negative, like I'm not going to share, to actually sharing, because they actually were going to share. They were going to share de-identified data or anonymized data. They were willing to share, but only under GDPR regulations, or we would share if there's a legitimate scientific, meritorious, or other justifiable reason. So actually there was, people didn't want to share. They just didn't say yes on that field. Of course, there were trials that went the other way. 26 trials went from positive to negative intent. And here people said they were going to share, but they were going to share with like their collaborators. Okay, I don't think that counts. Some of them were sharing only summary, not participant level data for the purposes of our study here. We said that really was a no. And some of them said they were going to share, but they're sharing protocols, the informed consent document. They weren't actually sharing data. So a tremendous amount of churn, but in the end, with the ups and the downs, it ended up pretty much the same, 15%. Okay, weren't able to bump that up anymore. So that's trial registrations. Now you might think, okay, what about the trials that actually get published? Maybe there's more value, more signal in the trials that actually get published. What happened there? So we looked at interventional trials, again, COVID-19 in humans. These are both publications of both protocols and results before August 9th, 2021. Ended up with 281 of them. And then we looked for their declaration to share data as declared in the publication. So once again, what percent of publications do you think, protocols and results of COVID interventional trials, said that they would share their data? So in the chat, let's see what do people think? 10. Okay, I'm not going to bias people. I'm just going to see what the. Okay. Oh, there may be some anchoring bias, I wonder. Okay, Allison, up at 75%. Okay. It sounds like people assume that the willingness to share at, great, Francis, at the publication point in the life cycle is the same as at registration. It seems like a lot of the numbers are the same. Let's see if that's true. 57%. 57% said that they would share. 10% said that they wouldn't share. Wow, okay. Remember, these are published studies, so certainly a very, very, biased subset of those who are registered, right? But of course, this is like some of the trials are ongoing. And then if we dive a little bit deeper in, of those that are published in ICMJE journals, and again, these are leading journals, New England Journal, Lancet, a proxy for importance, right? 65%, right? And a negative statement being 12%, right? And absolutely, Russ, it depends on how they're offering to share. We did dive down more into that, and I don't have that data, but at the top level, right, Francis, it was, they were willing to engage, in a real sharing. It wasn't like, it was an affirmative statement. Negative is still 12%. So, this is about as perhaps as good as we might expect it. I do want to, Russ, I think you're absolutely right that when we have to interrogate further, when people say they want to share, that's why in the trial registration piece, there are the articles that say, oh, they'll share, really need to dig down. And do they offer like an actual website, they offer, actual mechanisms for sharing as opposed to just sort of a global intent to share. Again, there was some movement back and forth from the time of registration to the time of publication. So 97 of the trials in the study were in our registration survey, and then we're also in the set of publications from ICMJE. So in these sort of follow-through cases, there was a notable shift from trials at registrations that they weren't going to share. By the time they published, they said they were going to share. So it went from 27%. These trials were already over the 15%. And then when they actually did get published in an ICMJE journal, they were more willing to share. So, you can see that people's ideas and declared intentions do change over time. So some of observations here, even in a global pandemic, the initial intent to share, IBD tops out at 15%, which is higher, but still not all that high. Much confusion about what constitutes data sharing, right? Some people, is it summary level data versus IPD? If it's de-identified, does it mean that I'm sharing it? If I share with just my collaborators, does that count as sharing? What is a legitimate requester? If I share study documents, does that count, right? And if I just have an email and say, just email me, does that count as data sharing? Right. And the intent to share changes over the life cycle of the study, influenced by results, by perceived importance. And in the next part of my talk, I would say, I think it's going to vary by institutional support. So that's what we took from that study. A natural experiment during COVID. Take that as you may. So right now, I'd like to flip the point of view to looking at a research institution like UCSF or Stanford, as we think about what are the pain points that individual investigators have, right? How do we support them to meet this, this data sharing policy from NIH in beginning of 2023? So this is work with Hopkins, Harvard, and Duke and UCSF, and together we sort of identified 4 big components here. And I would say that the bottom line is that even if you want to share as an investigator, data sharing is confusing, it feels risky, it isn't rewarded. So I think we are going to be talking about disincentives to sharing. A lack of incentives is also just super, super difficult, right? It's the difficult thing to do, not the easy thing to do. First component I'll discuss is outreach and training. It turns out there's, as I said, a lot of confusion. There's also a lot of confusion in institutions that support data sharing, the difference between sharing like mouse data or, X-ray diffraction data, data from humans in clinical trials, data from humans in EHR data, really different considerations. And I think Russ mentioned this earlier. Some fields just aren't quite sure what to do with it. And I think even, institutionally across many institutions, I think there's some confusion about what that means in the balance of openness versus privacy, for example. Lots and lots of mandates around, certainly NIH, the journal editors, private funders have their own, the Gates Foundation, for example. And then there are a proliferation of data sharing platforms that all serve like a little niche. It's not clear if you're in that niche or not. So beyond outreach and communication, really important to train the faculty, the staff, the fellows and students, and so forth. So a lot of work to do in outreach and training. And then once you get them, these are some really important points for an investigator to decide on. And I think there's just too little guidance about what to do. If you're going to share your study, do you want to have somebody review a data request? On what terms do you want that review? Do you want that review by yourself, which could be very biased? Do you want an independent panel to review it? And then who would that independent review panel be? Is it going to be expedited? Is it not? Do you need to anonymize your data? And if you do, how do you do it? How much is it going to cost? How do you know it's anonymized appropriately or enough? Do you want to share your data right now, or do you need an embargo period, and why? We really should be sharing our data as soon as possible, but there may be legitimate reasons for an embargo period. And then is the data downloadable? If they get access, do they just put it down on their laptop, or are you going to restrict people to use it within a secure research environment? These are the really difficult decisions, I think, for investigators to make that we pulled out of work in Vivli as we talk to investigators. And I think institutions need to help investigators think through these answers and maybe provide, a set of default policies and institutional support for these questions. Moving around, this components here, data stewardship and metrics. Jason calls this data husbandry. Absolutely, we need to have data and associated artifacts that really should be managed from study inception all the way through, right, with data sharing in mind. Interoperability standards, common data elements, thinking about real world evidence and what that looks like to manage that, and then institutional process metrics so that we can follow through on that life cycle management. I would say a few institutions have this global view, and fewer are capable of executing on this. I think this is where it would be great to get to, but it's very challenging. Legal compliance, always a source of risk and fear in clinical trials. Certainly institutional data licensing. Do you sign an agreement with, as a data contributor? Do you do that as an investigator? Does the institution do it on your behalf? If you're using data, do you sign a data use agreements, and are those terms appropriate or not? I think most of us investigators, don't know how to assess these agreements. I think there are a lot of challenges when there are studies at an academic medical center that have commercial sponsors. Who's responsible for, for sharing the data? All right, 3 years later, who's going to respond to somebody who wants to know more about the study? I think that's still quite unclear. IRB, obviously, some IRBs tend to sharing the identified data by default is something that we want to promote. That's what it is at UCSF. We went through a whole process and decided by default, we want to encourage and support people sharing the identified data. Some IRBs perhaps might think of data sharing more as an exception. We do need standardized wording in grants and protocols, standardized wording in consent forms as well to support our investigators. And lastly, academic affairs. Finally, research faculty do need to get promoted. And we do need a lot more thinking around metrics of data sharing, and we need to go beyond publications. So we actually looked at the data requests from Vivli, and these were the classes of use of the data sharing that we have found. So some people were using the analysis of participant level data to design future trials, to submit for regulatory approval, for grant applications. Sometimes the findings went into clinical guidelines, clinical care materials, algorithms, patient aid and decision support tools, statistical tools, web-based tools. So a lot of this is, going into tools or going to thinking about science, just as important. This is the range of societal benefits of data sharing, and we need to be thinking about them, identifying them, and having metrics for them so we capture the value. It's been very challenging right now. And then, of course, translating those metrics into actual coin of the realm incentives and actual credit so that they can help people get promoted, right? Does it increase citations? Does it then increase promotions? And I do want to say something about workforce. This requires a different class of professional, the research, IT, or informatics professional. They need to have ways of getting trained in academic medical institutions to get promoted and to have a rewarding career. So it's a challenging landscape, but I'm happy to say NIH is partly coming to the rescue. The Office of Data Science Strategy has funded a new program called the Generalist Repository Ecosystem Initiative, or GRAE. It is 6 generalist repositories, meaning they're disease agnostic. And you see them listed here. Vivli is the only one that is designed for clinical trials data. And we're so happy to be part of this. This program actually just launched this month. Lots of vision, missions, and approach, but really the goals are to make it easier for researchers to share data, to increase the discoverability of NIH-funded data, support greater reproducibility, avoid duplication, and increase reuse, right? Broad remit, everything that we need to do. I think we can sort of paste this onto the components here. So on the outreach piece, we're going to work jointly together on workshops, training, outreach, and resources. Given the kind of data you want to share, do you go to Figshare? Do you go to Mendeley? Do you go to Vivli, right? It's not often clear. A lot of work on this sort of the informatics part to make the repositories fair, common identifiers, metadata, thinking about a unified search and browse. We're going to define use cases so that we can increase sort of the social and legal infrastructure for data sharing, and then very importantly, identifying value and common metrics. So in summary here, I think there's increasing transparency of clinical trials from registration to summary data sharing to IPD sharing. There's a new policy coming in 2023. I think it's a great impetus for change. People are starting to realize it, but it really, again, it's not a mandate. 15% even for COVID interventional trials, really a large set of pain points and concerns. And I think it's incumbent upon research institutions to help individual investigators. This can't just rest on individual investigators. And I would hope that institutions take this on as a scientific opportunity and priority, and not purely as a regulatory one. I think that there's a lot here that's about science itself, and not just about meeting some policy. The GRAE project out of NIH is a co-opetition, so that's a cooperative competition of 6 repositories, and we're very excited to help NIH and the whole community increase the practice of data sharing. Broadly speaking, for NIH-funded work, Vivli specifically around clinical trials. So I will stop there, and really looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Ida. So maybe let's take a couple of questions. Russ, would you like to ask your question?
Sure, yeah. So thanks, Ida, that was really great. So one of the challenges that we've run into, so we run this data sharing platform called Open Neuro for kind of, research neuroimaging data. And in trying to figure out, thinking about metrics, it turns out to be really challenging to even sort of track which data sets have been reused because of the way that researchers sort of variably cite the data. So, we provide a DOI with every data set, but most researchers don't actually cite the DOI in their paper when they reuse the data. They discuss it, and any particular data set might be cited in 5 different ways, even though we provide the direction on how to cite it. I wonder if you've seen the same issues in sort of clinical trial data sharing, and if you have thoughts about sort of how to address that challenge.
Yeah, no, it's a big issue. I think in my OpenM health work, we also have open standards, and people use it. And, people keep saying, well, how many people are using OpenM health? It's like, we don't know, it's open. It's just, people just grab it and use it. There's a project called Make Data Count. And that's now quite agnostic, that people are banding together. And I think that's part of what we need to do as part of the NIH. And again, that's just the right place to do it. It's a community-wide thing. We need to set expectations. We need to get, publishers on board and everyone on board. Yeah, when you use a data set, you need to cite it and get that into the culture and give mechanism. So I think that's part of what Make Data Counts important. I think, we could start with just citing the data set, but I think we also do want to start capturing the actual value and how we define that and how we have metrics for that. I think it's completely open field.
Yeah. So a couple of questions in the chat. So from Michelle Mello, why do you think journals have been so slow to adopt data sharing policies with teeth? Many, maybe most, just require authors to say whether they will share and how. They don't require them to share.
Yeah, so I think we have Dr. Drazen here, which I'm sure I should defer to him on that question. I think sometimes when you're asked, you make something required, but the authors have a real hard time. The real hard time meeting it, as a journal that trying to get articles that might not be the thing. But Jeff, please, that's your question.
Right. So Michelle, the answer is that when it came to whether we published your work or not, we can control that. But the data sharing issue actually comes back to the time the trial is designed, and it really belongs in the hands of the funder, because it turns out that you have to start out with the idea that you're going to share your data, and that you have to be open to that. And in my remarks, I'm going to address the issues that Ida brought up. I think there are a number of other points there. But if a journal says, we're not going to publish your article until you send us the data, people are going to withdraw it until they find a journal where they will. And what do you mean by the data? Exactly what do you mean? Do you mean you want the individual x-rays? Do you want the interpretations of the x-rays? So it gets to be a very difficult issue. And we purposely said, what is it that you can share that's sort of relatively non-ambiguous? And we realized that it is less than perfect. But the thing that Ida didn't mention in her talk, and I'm going to bring up in my remarks, I'd like to hear what Frank has to say, is Ida didn't talk about fear. When I talk to investigators, fear is the biggest issue. And I'm going to talk about those components of fear during my 20-minute rebuttal to this. But there are lots, fear is a multifaceted problem. And it's what is driving most of the people's resistance. In fact, when you look at the data that Ida showed us just now, once your article gets published, that fear drops somewhat. And in the COVID, which is, talk about a clear public health emergency. I mean, none of us in our lives have had a bigger public health emergency than this. You're looking at something that went from on the order of 15 to 30% to 60%. It doubled because part of the fear is diminished by the publication, but it doesn't go away. And I think that's the biggest problem that we have to overcome is fear.
I'll say that, I want to say a little bit more about Vivly. Some people may not know very much about it. It is a platform by which you can share your data. Academics, pharma, we have now over 6,400 trials that you can get access to. Covering, 30 million participants actually. So, and many researchers have requested data. We've had publications on our data. So that whole cycle of, getting value out of data sharing is well underway. We have been thinking about and talked to some publishers and journals that we would host a data set. If you're going to publish in journal X and you're going to share, the data set is at Vivly and you can make a request for it. There's a whole set of policies around it. So we're really a platform that brokers this whole data sharing amongst multiple parties. And we also bridge to other registers like the NHLBI's BioLink repositories and so forth. So part of it is having that infrastructure. And to Jeff's point about fear, and Jeff, I'm thinking back, back to our meeting in London, where I think it was you who said, we need to hold hands and jump. There is definitely an element of fear for everybody in all of this. Working with pharma when I was at the WHO doing trial registration to register trials, pharma really, they were very, very, very scared. But we did it, we jumped, whether they wanted to or not. And now they have worked through fear in sharing participant level data. Most of the data that's shared on Vivli is from pharma. Academics are freaked out about this. And so I think as the NIH policy sets in, the fear will diminish. It is sort of free floating right now, but the more that we can think about infrastructures, the more we can think about fairness and metrics and credit, then I think we can make progress.